Welcome to Westminster Views. I'm Ruth Wheeler, and this is our program number 179. And today it is my privilege to speak with Betty Ryan. And I must tell you how I first met Betty. When I retired from Evanston High School, I started going to the Howard Johnson Motel Swimming Club. And who should I meet at the swimming club but Betty Ryan, who just had retired about the same time. So we have been friends for many years. It has been, Betty. Okay. Now, do you want to start telling us a little bit about your family?
Yes, I'd like to tell you about my family. Maybe I better tell you when I was born. May I do that? It's a long time ago, 1923. I was the oldest of 7 children. And my mother and father were Chicagoans. They both worked for the city of Chicago. Dad worked as a captain in the police department, and my mother was a teacher in the Chicago schools until she started having her children. And then there were 7 of us. So I went to parochial schools when I was a child, and I got interested in my life's work as a freshman in high school. We had to take Latin. And I realized that I really loved foreign languages. And that became a part of my career, starting with Latin, adding French when I was a sophomore in high school, and then going on in college by adding Spanish, another language. So that's kind of the beginning. Is there anything else that I've skipped?
No. Where did you go to college, and how did that work out?
Well, I went to Rosary College in River Forest, Illinois. That is now Dominican University. And it was a scholarship. Our family didn't have a lot of money for sending people to college. So luckily, I got a ride to college, but I had to commute from South Shore. We lived in South Shore, near the lake. That was nice. But the trip out to Rosary was for 4 years until I graduated.
And then after you graduated, you stayed on, didn't you?
After I graduated, I went on to get a master's. I knew I was going to be teaching, and I needed a master's to teach in high school. So I went to the University of Chicago and stayed there long enough to get a master's in Spanish. When I was getting my master's in Spanish, Rosary was looking for a Spanish teacher, Dominican University. So I went back to my alma mater and taught there for 6 years.
Okay. And then after that, what did you do?
After the 6 years, I went to France. I had applied for a scholarship, and it wasn't awarded immediately. But my family, my brother, my sister, and my aunt and I were going to do a trip to Europe. It was a big trip to Europe. By this time, it was 1950. And we went on a boat that had been a carrier of soldiers before. It was the Volendam. And it took us 10 days to cross the Atlantic.
Oh, boy.
We had a wonderful trip in Europe. And to get to the end of that, by August, we were all ready to go back to our jobs in Chicago. But luckily, the scholarship that I had applied to came through at that point.
Well, tell them it was a Fulbright.
Well, it was a Fulbright. And so we were in Paris. We were all leaving Paris to go back to the States. And I had to stay in Paris because the Fulbright year was going to begin in October, and this was only the beginning of September. But this was really a joyous discovery because it meant that I could live in Paris for 2 whole months and enjoy everything that Paris has to offer. And everybody that's listening to me knows about that. I did first have to find some place to live. And the idea was for a foreign language teacher, you lived with a family because you wanted to speak the language all the time. And hopefully you were able to eat with the family so you could have intelligent conversation in the foreign language with the family. So I did find a place, to make it short, I had a wonderful 2 months in Paris, actually. I went to plays that I had read in school, and now I had a chance to see the plays with real French actors. I visited all the museums. I walked along the Seine and the bookstalls, got out to Versailles, and did everything that every tourist wishes they had plenty of time to do when they're in Paris. The beginning of October, there was a bit of it wasn't an interruption, it was a joyous interruption. The Fulbrighters had all gathered in Paris, and we were to have an orientation at the Sorbonne, in French, of course, and that was marvelous. We had wonderful French-speaking, obviously, professors who gave us an introduction of what kind of thing French life would be like in the provinces and all that. It was very, very interesting. It was kind of terrifying. I had realized I had had a wonderful education at Dominican University in French, because actually I could speak French better than some of the other Fulbrighters who had gone to fancy universities, but they didn't have the same technique of teaching that the Rosary people did. So anyway, that was, what I was getting to was that one of the girls had come with her mother, and she couldn't manage the whole thing, so she went back home to the States. But the rest of us diverged at the end of our October to our various universities, and I was going to the University of Grenoble in the French Alps. Getting to Grenoble, I then again had to find a place to live, and I luckily found a good place a little bit outside of town. It was a 10-minute bus ride into the university, and I had a gorgeous view of the French Alps. So that was an academic year in France. It was joyous to be studying French with French. Other students were French-speaking, were French themselves. And I also joined a choral group there to get to know more French students. Was able to do a little beginning skiing in the French Alps because the students went out for fairly inexpensive tour trips in the mountains. So that was pleasant. I had a wonderful vacation in Switzerland. I was invited to be the chaperone for a group of Dominican University students who were studying in Switzerland for that year. So that was lovely. We stayed in the town of Wengen and rode on no cars in Wengen, so we were in horse-drawn carriages, that kind of thing, and had wonderful skiing and a good trip up to the Jungfrau and that kind of thing. So that came to the end of the year. And Ruth, shall I move on now to Spain? Or
Yeah.
I have to
Let's go to
I
Spain.
have to move to Spain because I'm going to go back to Dominican to my Spanish-speaking job. They were very nice to let me take the year off when I got this scholarship at the last minute, so I was going back. But I needed to brush up a little bit on the Spanish, and I knew some Americans who were happily going to spend a whole month driving to all the major cities in Spain. So I traveled along with them, visiting every place we could, speaking Spanish as much as we could. And at the end of that month, that was the end of June, I still had till the fall. Oh, and I should mention here that the Fulbright grants were pretty generous, but I needed a little extra help from my aunt. That was the aunt that traveled to Europe that will be traveling to Europe with us at another time, and was able to enroll in a Spanish course for foreigners at Palma de Mallorca, if you believe it. It was on the island of Palma, sponsored by the University of Barcelona. And it was a lovely time that I remember with joy even now. We met in the morning on the shores of the Mediterranean under a spreading tree, guided by a professor from the University of Barcelona, and the job under the tree was to speak Spanish. We were able to do that with natives because the natives wanted to join us. The natives of Mallorca wanted to be friends with all these Europeans. They were mostly Europeans. I was the only American. But they joined us so we could practice Spanish speaking with them. That was the morning. In the middle of the day, we could swim, and in the evening, we drove into Palma. We went on a trolley into Palma and had serious classes in the evening of culture and language. So that was Palma de Mallorca, and by the end of the time that I had done that, I was ready to go back to my job in River Forest in Chicago.
Okay. And you stayed there for 2 or 3 more years?
Yes, I was there. Well, the next important date that I want to mention is, let me make sure I've got this straight, 1957. Now we're jumping a little bit. I did some graduate work at the University of Wisconsin toward maybe a PhD. I did all the coursework, but I was a little hesitant to bury myself in libraries to do the work required for the PhD. So instead, I took a trip to Europe, and that gets into my siblings a little bit. By this time, the other 6 children had grown up, and my next sister, whose name was Virginia, had married a Belgian doctor, and they were in Brussels. My brother, who was 6 years younger than I, had taken a job with the American government in Germany, interviewing the people that come into the country and need permission. Anyway, that's what he was. So the 2 of them were there with small families. Each of them had children ranging from 4 to 1, 3 children each. So I had plenty to do for that year in Europe. But when I went to Brussels, I was going actually to say goodbye to my sister and her Belgian doctor husband and the 3 children, because they were going to the Belgian Congo. When they got married, they had agreed between themselves that they wanted to devote their lives to working for an underprivileged country. Not underprivileged country, but an underprivileged colony. And Belgium was a good place to go because Belgium had a wonderful colony in the middle of Africa. I'll just hold up Africa. It's this whole area. The Belgian Congo is this part right here. I could hold a pencil to it. You could get the idea that it's in the middle. It's in the middle of Africa on the equator. They were going there to a mission that was a hospital and schools combined, and they were, of course, were taking the 3 children. They were still in Brussels because Christian had to do some work planning for. He already had his doctor's degree, of course, but he had to do some tropical medicine studies, which were available in Belgium. And my sister, as a housewife, was being given lots of tips on how to be a housewife in the depths of the tropics. While I was there in Belgium, they said to me, "Why don't you come with us?" Well, the whole question seemed ridiculous to me because I was in the middle of deciding what to do about my academic future. I said, "Oh my goodness, I don't think I could ever do that. That's not for me right now," and so on. So anyway, they left. It was February of 1957, and they left for the Congo on a boat that was to take them to the capital there. I, in the meantime, was still going to be visiting my brother and his little family who were in Germany. So that turned out to be a very good thing for my foreign language because I enrolled in an interpreters institute, and I learned a lot of German there. It was let me give some German for those of you who understand it. You'll enjoy Sprachen- und Dolmetscherinstitut. And I was in a class with other Americans who were studying German in order to get into the opera. It was much easier to break into the opera in Germany in that year, 1957, than I think it ever was here in the States. So I got to know German students, got to know some German, and by that time I had thought over this business of the Congo and thought maybe I should go. So I decided, I called them and said, "Yep, I'll go with you." Well, they were already gone. They had to leave in February, but I had said this a little bit before, and so my job was to get a visa and get myself to the Congo. Why was I going? Well, I too had idealistic notions of what I could do with my life, and I really did want to help them. So I was in the Congo for 2.5 years. What did I do there? Well, the fact that I knew French was important because Belgium was a French and Flemish-speaking country, but the major European language in the Congo, and done by all the officials, the Belgian officials that were there, that measure was French. So I was able to do the paperwork. There was a lot of paperwork between Africa and Brussels, and I was able to relieve one of the nuns. This was a Catholic mission. One of the nuns who was a nurse who had spent her time on paperwork, she was able to go back to nursing, and I could do that. Oh, it wasn't full-time, but it was one of the things I could help with. I would travel with my brother-in-law to the bush to bring back sick people who were in smaller villages and who needed care at the hospital. And at that time, we also had a setup for weighing babies. If you weighed a baby and the baby was not gaining weight, there was something the matter. And so we took them back. We had a station wagon, and we took them back to the hospital, and they were cared for there. Another major major hospital thing for the Congo was cesareans. The women in the particular tribe where we were in a town called, not a town, it was the mission, a mission called Ipamo. The town was many miles away on the river. That was called Mangai. Anyway, there were a lot of cesareans because the people in that tribe were rather narrowly built, and if they had their babies in the village, they might lose either the baby or themselves. So one of the jobs of the doctor was to get all the pregnant women to the hospital and prenatal treatment, and then to be there for the birth or to do the cesarean. So Christian had a lot of cesareans while we were there. What else did I do? I worked in the garden. We grew vegetables, and one of the jobs, of course, there was a gardener who did the planting and attending, but my job was to get out there and cover everything just before noon, not just before, but maybe about 10 a.m., before it got too hot, and cover them with palm fronds and so on, and then get back out there 4 hours later and take this cover down. So that was a little trotting job. Oh, we wore tropical helmets. We looked very, very colonial. And now let me get to the children a little bit. My sister's job was to manage the various things that had to go on in a house. We didn't have running water. So she had to arrange for having water brought from a spring nearby, which would then be poured in a big cistern on the roof, and it would serve for, we had a bathroom, but it would serve, we needed the water to use the bathroom, so it was could take showers and so forth from the water on the roof. So there was water carrying, there was laundry to be done. There was cooking. The stove was out in the back in a little shack. We didn't have refrigeration, but there was an experienced cook. My brother-in-law substituted for a doctor who had been there before and had some people already trained. And when our group arrived in Ipamu, all the workers who had worked for the previous doctor were like, "Oh, boy, we got a job again." So there was somebody to clean the house, and then she had to do ordering of other kinds of food besides vegetables. We had to order from Leopoldville, which was the capital, and it was a matter of ordering at Leopoldville and sometimes getting things from France and Belgium. So that was a 6-hour trip. So that's what she was doing. And how am I doing for time, Ruth?
Okay. We need to move along.
All right, we'll move along. Well, there are a lot of stories I could tell. Rubber plant. Oh, there was a Protestant mission nearby, and we very happy. These were Americans, and we could get together for them for the 4th of July, for various holidays. And a rubber planter was in charge of a rubber plantation, and he had a pool. Had made a pool for us to go to. So on weekends, we would meet the other fellow Americans, and we would meet at the pool and swim. And another recreation was we could go to town and see American Western movies once a week. The Congolese had a clubhouse, and they lent it to us for weekends, so we could do that. One of us would stay at the mission with the children, and so 2 of us would go in, and we would take turns to do that. Well, after 3 years, it was time for my brother-in-law to have a leave. After 3 years, they get 6 months of leave, and the 3 years was ending. I had been there 2.5 because I came a little bit later. So we got ready and came back to Chicago. The situation at home had changed a little bit. Unfortunately, my father had died while we were away, and my mother was alone because the other siblings were doing other things. One of my sisters had gone into the convent, and a brother was in the clergy, and another sister got married and had already had 3 children. This is the youngest girl in the family, my sister Peggy. So there were a lot of different activities going on in Chicago, but the big house was open for the Congo visitors to stay for a whole 6-month period. However, when they went back, it was my decision to stay in Chicago for a while. I had intended to go back, and I felt that I was being fairly useful in the Congo. I had taught a nephew to read, and that was really fun. I was using Scott Forsman materials for that, Dick and Jane, and he just loved it. So I was teaching them and a couple of other things that I probably have forgotten to mention. Anyhow, I didn't go back. Instead, I stayed. I had the 19-year-old brother and a helper who had been with our family for years, and got a job in publishing. Now, this was a big switch for me because I had always been a teacher before I went to the Congo. However, the job came up all of a sudden. A friend of mine was working for SRA Publishing Company that's still existing today.
Science Research Associates.
That's right, Science Research Associates. They did reading labs. And do you know that company is still existing? Good. And they work now with Scott McGill. One of the other publishers anyway, whichever one it was. And they have added to that kind of material that they were doing in those days.
And while you were there, you did something else very interesting.
While I was there was a big interruption on the outside. The civil rights movement had gotten really kind of heated up. There was a lot of activity in Selma, Alabama. There was a Voting Rights Act going on. And something that attracted national attention was something that happened when a nonviolent march was started out of Selma. They were going to go to Montgomery to plead for the voting rights in Selma. Of course, the problem was all over the South, but Selma was a particular place at this time. Well, these marchers were starting to march across the bridge, and you will have read about it because I still have clippings that are all over the papers in 1964, and it drew a lot of attention, and particularly in Chicago. There were Chicago religious groups getting together, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, and I really wanted to go. I felt that I could get away from my job for a while, and I had been a little bit involved in civil rights ideas before that when I was in college and so forth. So I decided I'd try to go, but how could I get there? I didn't know how to get to Selma safely, or alone. And so I called the Catholic Interracial Council to see if they were sending a group, and indeed they were. And they said, if you can get over to O'Hare by X amount of time tomorrow, you can come with us. There was a group going. There were priests, and there were nuns, and there were lay people. And it ended up there would be about 200 people in Selma, but that particular group probably about 40. So I got to the airport. We transferred at Atlanta, transferred again to get to Selma. To get to Montgomery, and from Montgomery, we were met by cars that took us to Selma. And by that time, there was enough preparation made that we knew we'd have a place to stay and places to eat. And guess what? The natives in the black section were all hosting all of us who were visiting. And we were to have our meals at the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. We were to stay within the black area, not to leave. It was dangerous. A Protestant minister had been killed just within 2 or 3 weeks before that, and they were a little worried about violence. So I was signed into a house that housed 2 priests, 2 ministers, and 3 women, one of whom was the mother of 3 children who had come down there for the same purpose that I did. Anyway, what we did there basically was we would meet during the daytime, and we did have some lessons in order to be able to protect ourselves in case there was any violence. There was expecting there could be some. And we met in the evening. We agreed to be at the to place a vigil, be on a vigil at a line that separated the black section. On the other side of the line were state troopers that would spend all the night there in their cars and so on. And also there was a podium where black preachers would tell jokes and so on, and would especially preach. And the preaching was extremely moving, including to all the clergy who were there. They looked very, I don't know, surprised or whatever the good word is. The preaching was all about nonviolence and about love. It was entirely positive and very, very moving. We stood there. There was no violence while we were there, while we were on the line. There was just the preaching, and some of the troopers were asleep in their squad cars, so we didn't feel threatened. In the daytime, I remember one incident in the daytime. A little girl we were on the steps of the AME church and waiting for lunch, I guess, and she was singing, and there was a man in our audience who had not a violin, but a guitar with him. So he accompanied the little girl, and she was singing some songs, just some children's songs, and also sang one song, the words of which I remember. And then eventually we were singing along with him as we learned the words. And this one song was, I don't know, I think it's right. All in heaven is black and white. Come on, come on, come on. So we love that. Anyway, the whole week ended with our grouping in the living room of the place where we were staying. There were 6 of us, Northerners, and there was our family that we were staying with, and the president was giving a speech. President Lyndon Johnson. Now, they had had a civil rights bill in Congress for a while, but it hadn't been acted on. But this was a joint session of Congress with our Southern President, Johnson, giving a marvelous talk that reached all of us so closely that I think none of us will ever forget it. I can't quote all of the things that he said, but he did end up with we shall overcome, and we shall overcome. And he looked around he used to be a senator. He looked around at his fellow senators with this glare. It was marvelous, and the blacks, and we were all just delighted and felt very, very close to the whole situation before we left. Well, I went back to Chicago to my job, and colleagues at not Scott Forsman, but SRA, were eager to hear about it, and pretty soon they were signing up to go on the next march. And the next march was to be, I didn't mention that Martin Luther King did come to Selma while we were there, and we had a march through the town. It was uneventful. There were people sitting on their porches, and they were, shouting kind of nice, nasty things to us. But that was good to have King there. But there was to be another one in June, and that was to go to Montgomery, and that one was going to be protected by the government at that point.
You didn't go on that one.
No, I didn't go on that one. Friends went.
Now we need to move along.
Okay, let's go along.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then you came back, and you ended up at Scott Forsman.
Yes, I ended up at Scott Forsman. It was very interesting at SRA, but my particular love of foreign languages wasn't being represented there, and a job was offered to me at Scott Forsman here in Glenview. So I started at Scott Forsman and was there for 17 years. I'll add that the major things that I was involved in producing with a group of editors and writers and authors from the outside, the whole thing from the beginning of
foreign language.
Foreign language, yeah, French and Spanish, and English is a foreign language. And I can say that job was glamorous. It was a hard job, but it became very glamorous because you visited all the teachers' meetings, and they met in Paris. French teachers met in Paris, and then they met in Hawaii and in Puerto Rico and in many of the cities in this country that have good facilities for conventions. So there was travel, there was a lot of hard work, but there was a sense of, working with teachers was just wonderful. Most of the people that work in the editorial divisions of educational publishing companies are former teachers. And so they all cared so much about what they were doing and about producing good materials. It was a very satisfying job, but I was happy to retire in 1985, and I could describe a very lovely transmission from doing that kind of work. I did represent a British publishing company, for a while after I retired, and then just got doing retiring things, which have all been fascinating, and came here 2.5 years ago, and I've been very happy to be here. And thank you for everybody for listening. Do you have any other questions?
The other thing I wanted to mention was that with Scott Forsman, you were the first woman vice president.
There were two
Right.
of us so close together that I don't remember whether I was first or
No,
whether
you
she
were.
was first.
You
But there
were.
were, yeah, that's right.
That's good. Good for the women.
Well, it was good. It was the right time I was in the right place at the right time. They were actually looking for people to promote because there was pressure on the outside, you know. But
Yeah.
yes, it was a very good job, a very interesting, very, very interesting job.
Yeah,
So
right. So
that's it.
that's it. Okay. Well, we thank you, Betty, very, very much. You've had a fascinating life, and I know you're involved in a lot of things here when we didn't get into that, but that's okay. And I want to thank you for being our guest. Our director today was Caroline McCarty, and Jan Connor, Bob Morris, and Chris Renault are part of our crew. And our fine camera people today are Ruth Zukowski and Bill Redlake, and we thank them very much. And Doug Saline will show this on Wednesday night on 9:51 at 7:15, and so tell your friends to watch it if they haven't watched it today. And our next live show will be on Monday, July 21st, and Jan Connor will interview Pat Fiorio, and she'll find out about all her various jobs. And thank you again for watching and listening, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks.